Welcome to the Depth Dive. Today, we're really getting into something pretty heavy, looking at some urgent and, frankly, quite explosive sources.
Yeah, it all centers around one particular analysis from Simon Dixon. Now, for listeners who might not know, he's a real Bitcoin OG, an investor, also a geopolitical and financial analyst, quite the background.
Absolutely. And we're diving into his deep analysis, which was originally featured in an interview on Bitcoin Archives. He then replayed that on his own show, BitcoinHardTalk Ep.101.
And the title he gave it really sets the tone. BlackRock's evil plan to steal your Bitcoin exposed.
Wow. Yeah, that's not subtle.
Not at all, and it tells you the gravity of what we need to unpack here. It's a full spectrum warning, really. Dixon's core point, drawing on his, 14 years in crypto and TradFi,
Right.
is stark. He's basically saying that 99% of people, and this includes people who already hold Bitcoin, are currently falling for a massive coordinated scheme.
Falling for it, how?
Well, he argues it's a systematic effort, orchestrated by Wall Street players like BlackRock, aimed at centralizing control over Bitcoin's fixed supply. It's not just about price swings, it's about who ultimately controls the asset.
Okay, right. Let's unpack this because, as you said, Dixon doesn't see this attack phase on Bitcoin just happening in a vacuum.
No, definitely not.
He places it within this huge, honestly, kind of terrifying global, macro, and geopolitical context. So what's the environment? What's this big structural shift, he says, is letting Wall Street pull this off now?
Okay, so he says we're deep into what he calls the fiscal dominance phase.
Fiscal dominance. Okay, what does that mean in simple terms?
It's basically when monetary policy, the stuff the central bank does, and fiscal policy, which is government spending and taxes, effectively merge. They become one and the same.
And why does that happen?
Out of necessity, he argues. Governments have basically painted themselves into a corner. They're structurally unable to cut spending or impose any real austerity without risking, political collapse.
So the government has this spending addiction, and it has to be fed.
Exactly. The government debt just keeps growing and growing, and the central bank just accommodates it. They essentially print money, electronically or otherwise, to cover the government's bills.
Right.
And Dixon calls this a system that's become addicted to spending. Debt monetization is the only politically viable path left.
Okay, and a key point here, I think, is that this constant money printing isn't neutral, is it?
Yeah.
Dixon argues it acts like a targeted reallocation of resources across the whole economy. So where's this new money actually going?
Yeah, that's crucial. He pinpoints two main destinations, and they show a clear strategic pivot by, global powers.
Okay.
First, what he calls the technical industrial complex. Think artificial intelligence. Massive government contracts for companies like Palantir, trillion-dollar commitments to the infrastructure needed for things like OpenAI.
Right, the AI boom.
Exactly. And second, the military-industrial complex. No surprise there, perhaps. But the effect is it siphons huge amounts of capital, talent, and energy away from, productive, consumer-focused parts of the economy.
Which sounds like a guaranteed way to create more inequality. Is that where this K-shaped economy idea comes in?
It absolutely is. The K-shaped economy is the direct result of this structure. All that spending and capital flowing into AI and military contracts inflates assets at the top of the K.
So stocks, real estate.
Stocks, real estate, gold, even Bitcoin itself. Asset owners get richer, exponentially richer.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the inflation created by all that debt monetization just crushes people at the bottom of the K.
The average person.
The average consumer, yeah. They're forced into high-interest debt, sometimes paying like 30% or 40% on credit cards just to make ends meet.
So the system itself is engineered, in his view, to create both asset inflation for the wealthy and potentially civil unrest among the poor.
That's the argument.
What specific market signs does Dixon point to as proof that this is really about dollar devaluation, not some kind of healthy economic growth?
Well, he looks at the fact that all these major, normally uncorrelated assets are rising together. Bitcoin hitting new all-time highs, gold surging past $4,000, stock markets looking euphoric.
Right. You wouldn't normally expect all those to boom simultaneously.
Exactly. Dixon stresses this isn't because companies are suddenly way more productive or these assets have found some new utility. He says it's entirely down to the rapid, accelerating devaluation of the dollar.
So the assets are just trying to keep up with the currency being debased.
Pretty much. The U.S. government, he argues, is using inflation, tariffs, aggressive spending. These are tactics to basically extract wealth from consumers and devalue its own massive debt pile. The assets are just reflecting that reality.
Okay, that sets a pretty grim stage. Debt, devaluation, engineered inequality. So now let's get into part one, the Wall Street attack phase. You mentioned Bitcoin's anti-fragile nature, how it's survived attacks from banks, regulators for, what, over a decade now?
Yeah, more than that.
So why is this current phase, the Wall Street attack phase, as he calls it, why is this one so much more urgent, so much more dangerous in his view?
Because the game has completely changed. Look, historically, the powers that be, the centralized institutions, they tried to crush Bitcoin. They thought it would fail, or at least remain some fringe niche thing.
And it didn't.
It proved them wrong, big time, culminating in, a network worth over $2 trillion at its peak. So now, Wall Street isn't trying to stop it anymore. They realize they can't. Instead, they're trying to co-opt it.
Co-opt it and control it.
And control it, precisely. Through centralization. That's the new attack vector.
Dixon uses this really compelling metaphor, doesn't he? He says we're in a kind of time-sensitive scramble.
Yes, he's quite emphatic about this. He insists we are in a 5-year race. He believes the next 5 years will bring about the fastest, most profound shift the world has ever witnessed.
A 5-year race for what?
To accumulate as much Bitcoin as possible, specifically in self-custody, before it's too late. Because the key mechanism of this Wall Street attack is the creation of what he calls the two-tier Bitcoin world.
Okay.
And this represents the ultimate centralization trap.
Describe this two-tier system for us, because this sounds like where the listener's personal choices really start to matter.
It's a deliberate split, he argues. Tier 1 is Bitcoin held in custody. Now, this includes all the Bitcoin bought through these new ETFs everyone's talking about.
Right, the spot ETFs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Also, Bitcoin held in pensions, Bitcoin used as collateral for loans, Bitcoin sitting on the balance sheets of public companies like MicroStrategy. Wall Street is basically weaponizing custody itself as the centralization tool.
Okay, that's tier 1. What's tier 2?
Tier 2 is self-custody. This is where you, the individual, hold your own private keys. You truly own the asset. It's free from third-party risk, free from censorship, free from surveillance.
Now, the traditional critics, people like Peter Schiff, for example, they often dismiss Bitcoin saying it has no real utility. It's not used for dentistry like gold or in electronics. How does Dixon tackle that specific, very long-running criticism?
He flips it completely. He argues the utility of Bitcoin isn't what you do with it in the physical world, like making fillings. The utility is self-custody itself.
The ability to hold it yourself is the utility.
Yes. It's the only way to genuinely opt out of the increasingly centralized surveillance state that's being built around the traditional financial system. Bitcoin, when held in self-custody, operates on a fundamentally different principle. Innocent until proven guilty.
That's quite a profound political idea embedded in a financial technology.
It really is. And he contrasts that sharply with the system we're supposedly opting out of.
How does he describe that system, the fiat banking system?
He paints a pretty bleak picture. He calls it an inevitable, predictable, 1984 Orwellian nightmare in the making. It functions, he says, on a guilty until proven innocent basis. Mass surveillance is the default.
Does he give examples?
Yeah, he mentioned startling anecdotes like international bank transfers taking up to 6 months to clear because they get stuck in endless know your customer, KYC, and anti-money laundering, AML checks. The system basically treats every single user as a potential criminal or terrorist until they can prove otherwise.
Wow. 6 months.
Yeah. And he asserts the ultimate goal of this fiat system, the inevitable endpoint, is the digital programmable social credit score.
Now, that sounds like something out of dystopian sci-fi, but he connects it to technology that exists right now, doesn't he?
He does. He argues this isn't fiction. It's the predictable destination when currency becomes purely digital and remains centralized. Money itself becomes, in his words, a financial weapon of mass destruction.
How so?
He sees the integration of things like universal basic income, UBI, with a mandatory digital ID and a social credit score as basically inevitable. If your money is programmable, the state, or whoever controls the network, can dictate how, where, and when you spend it.
Based on your behavior or compliance?
Exactly. Based on your social credit score, your compliance rating, whatever metric they choose. He specifically points to Elon Musk's push for stricter KYC and digital ID integration on X, formerly Twitter, coupled with the rapidly expanding AI capabilities of companies like Palantir as sort of the beta test for this future compliance system.
The stakes really couldn't be higher then. Okay, we need to focus on the main orchestrator Dixon identifies in this centralization scheme. That brings us neatly to part 2. BlackRock, the attack mechanisms, and what he calls the beta test. He uses some really strong language comparing BlackRock to a historical entity.
He does. He calls BlackRock the American version of the East India Company.
That's a dramatic comparison.
It is, and he doesn't make it lightly. Remember, the East India Company wasn't just a trading company. It operated like its own military, political, and financial power. In some places, it was arguably more powerful than the British Crown itself.
And Dixon sees BlackRock wielding similar power today.
He argues BlackRock wields power that is functionally greater than the U.S. government, mainly because they control such vast global capital flows. They direct where the money goes.
Right, controlling the flow of capital. And that's where their proprietary technology, Aladdin, comes in, isn't it?
Exactly. Aladdin is the key. It's this huge, complex risk management system. It advises asset managers, big institutions, even the Federal Reserve, on literally tens of trillions of dollars worldwide.
Tens of trillions.
Yes. So when Aladdin suggests a certain risk profile or an asset allocation, it effectively steers the behavior of institutional money on a global scale. Dixon views this concentration of influence as creating a kind of legitimate shadow government.
Okay, so they have this immense institutional influence. How do they translate that into what Dixon calls the proof of weapons network to actually consolidate Bitcoin?
Well, the mechanism is deceptively simple, according to him. They use things like tax efficiency and financial compliance as weapons. Take the ETFs and institutional pensions. These structures are often tax advantaged, right? They incentivize individuals and institutions to put their Bitcoin into these products rather than hold it themselves.
So you buy the ETF thinking you own Bitcoin.
But you don't, not really. You don't hold the keys. You've essentially surrendered your ownership, your conviction, to a centralized intermediary, BlackRock or whoever runs the ETF.
By pooling all these individual holdings,
BlackRock gains consolidated control over a massive amount of Bitcoin. This concentrated power, this pool of keys they effectively control, that is the proof of weapons network. They now have immense voting rights in any governance decisions, huge market leverage. They can exert real influence over the entire Bitcoin ecosystem.
this implies that past crypto crises, the big collapses we've seen, weren't just accidents or market volatility. Dixon claims they were actually intentional, strategic moves.
That's a core part of his argument.
Let's dig into his investigation of the Celsius bankruptcy. He calls that a deliberate beta test. What does he mean by that?
Right, so Dixon argues that collapses like Celsius back in 2021 were engineered, or at least exploited, to achieve two critical goals for Wall Street.
Okay, what were they?
First, make the decentralized crypto industry look bad. Paint it as reckless, full of scams, unreliable. Scare the general public away from self-custody and DeFi.
Okay, create fear. And the second goal?
Second, to ultimately facilitate the transfer of control and the assets themselves into the regulated, safe hands of Wall Street institutions like BlackRock. Clear the decks for their own entry.
Now, his perspective here is pretty unique because he was actually involved in the Celsius Chapter 11 bankruptcy case for 2 years, wasn't he?
Deeply involved. He personally reviewed something like 4,000 documents related to the case.
And what did he find in all those documents?
He says he found evidence of, and I quote him here, absolute foul play and disturbing connections, he claims, to deep state actors in intelligence operations. He explicitly mentions the CIA and Mossad in his analysis.
Okay, those are extremely serious claims. We need specifics. What details did he provide to back up this assertion of intelligence involvement and foul play? These aren't things you just throw around lightly.
No, absolutely not. And we should stress, we're reporting Dixon's findings here. He pointed to specific operational links that, in his view, suggest a planned outcome rather than just, bad risk management by Celsius. For instance, he tracked Daniel Leon, a former Celsius executive, who notably avoided prison time. Leon apparently escaped to Israel and then got involved in an AI company that Dixon alleges has connections to the Israeli Prime Minister's office.
Okay.
And furthermore, Leon's wife reportedly became head of social media for the Israeli Defense Force. Then there's the infamous Bancor DAO hack where Celsius lost a lot of client ether. Dixon claims that major shareholders in that DAO were related to the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu specifically, his niece and nephew.
So the narrative Dixon puts forward is that this wasn't just a company failure, but potentially something orchestrated to consolidate assets and protect certain players.
That seems to be his interpretation of the evidence he reviewed. Yes. A failure that conveniently transferred power and, crucially, kept the pool of assets largely intact.
What was the pivotal decision during the bankruptcy proceedings that, in his view, confirmed this direction?
Well, despite it being revealed as a multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme affecting, what, 650,000 victims?
A huge number.
Huge. Dixon actually successfully lobbied the judge not to force an immediate fire sale of the bankrupt company's Bitcoin holdings.
Why? Wouldn't that have helped the creditors get some money back faster?
It preserves some value for creditors in the longer run, yes. But Dixon's point is that the ultimate outcome was that this large, consolidated pool of Bitcoin wasn't dispersed. It was stabilized, protected, potentially making it easier for acquisition or management by centralized players later on, essentially preserving the asset pool for the proof of weapons network.
Okay, so this alleged beta test with Celsius happens. Then it's followed by what Dixon sees as a coordinated regulatory attack. Operation Choke Point 2.0.
Correct. He doesn't see Operation Choke Point 2.0 as just random bank failures or increased regulatory scrutiny. He views it as a synchronized, deliberate effort.
With what goal?
The immediate goal, he argues, was to systematically eliminate crypto-friendly banks. Even banks that were supposedly solvent, like Signature Bank, wipe them out to create a vacuum.
And the effect of that?
Twofold. It reinforces the public narrative that crypto is inherently unstable and risky. And very importantly, it clears the path, regulatorily speaking, for BlackRock's eventual ETF approval. It removes potential competition and shuts down decentralized on-ramps and off-ramps.
And the regulatory side, the apparent favoritism, seems quite stark based on his account.
It really does. He points out that established, compliant companies like Coinbase and Kraken apparently couldn't even get meetings with SEC Chair Gary Gensler. Yet somehow, Sam Bankman-Fried of FTX seemed to have an open door.
Which looks odd, to say the least, in retrospect.
To say the least. So the net result of all this regulatory maneuvering and capture, Dixon argues, was the eventual approval of the spot Bitcoin ETFs. But it happened under the guise of a pro-crypto policy shift, which also allowed banks to start leveraging Bitcoin on their balance sheets and primary dealers like Cantor Fitzgerald to offer fiat loans against Bitcoin collateral.
So they basically built the perfect infrastructure.
The perfect regulated financialized infrastructure needed for Wall Street to step in and begin consolidating control.
Right. This is where it gets really fascinating, how public companies that hold Bitcoin on their balance sheets get pulled into this proof of weapons network. Let's talk about MicroStrategy. MSTR is the ticker in part 3.
Yeah, MSTR is a prime example in Dixon's analysis. He sees it as a major target. It looks safe, right? A public company holding a huge amount of Bitcoin, not on an exchange. But he argues it's being positioned as this immense potential weapon for the financial industrial complex.
A weapon?
Yeah.
Such as holding Bitcoin. What's the mechanism BlackRock or Wall Street could use to gain control over MicroStrategy's Bitcoin treasury?
It's all about its potential or probable future inclusion in the S&P 500 index.
Ah, becoming part of the index. Why is that the key?
Because once MSTR is in the S&P 500, every single passive index fund and ETF that tracks the S&P 500, including the massive ones managed by BlackRock, is mandated to buy MSTR stock. They have no choice. It's part of the index methodology.
Regardless of whether they think MSTR is good investment.
Exactly. Regardless of conviction. This passive, forced buying flow automatically turns BlackRock and other large index managers into dominant shareholders of MicroStrategy.
And with that dominant shareholding comes
Power. They get board seats. They get operational leverage. They can influence how that massive consolidated treasury of Bitcoin held by MSTR is managed, maybe even how it's collateralized or lent out. It effectively transfers control of that independent pool of Bitcoin into the centralized proof of weapons honeypot.
So the goal isn't just the ETFs, it's also acquiring control over these big corporate treasuries to amass this strategic centralized honeypot of Bitcoin.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And using leverage to accelerate it. Wall Street loves leverage, right? Dixon talks about tactics like leveraged buyouts, LBOs, to acquire companies holding Bitcoin, especially if their stock price crashes. He points to examples like the company Nakamoto, which apparently crashed 96%, making it a ripe target for a leveraged takeover to get the Bitcoin on its books cheaply.
And the strategic goal of this honeypot, how much Bitcoin are we talking about?
The long-term goal, Dixon speculates, is for Wall Street, spearheaded by BlackRock, to amass control over maybe 1 to 2 million Bitcoin in this centralized manner.
1 to 2 million Bitcoin.
That's the number he throws out. A strategic reserve that they can then deploy during geopolitical crises or in currency wars or to manage market conditions to their advantage.
Okay, if this is happening, what are the warning signs? What are the inflection points that listeners should be watching for to know that this institutional takeover is reaching a critical stage, maybe the point of maximum danger?
The number one indicator, he says, is maximum leverage building up in the system, especially leverage against Bitcoin collateral.
So watch the lenders.
Yes. Keep a very close eye on the lenders who are aggressively offering fiat loans backed by Bitcoin. He specifically names Cantor Fitzgerald and another entity called World Liberty Financial as ones to watch. Also, monitor stablecoin activity very closely. Stablecoins are often the lubricant for this kind of leverage.
Anything else?
And be aware of the potential for increased manipulation, possibly facilitated by Palantir's AI technology, influencing public perception, or even market movements. The ultimate inflection points, Dixon warns, are likely to coincide with major geopolitical conflict, maybe a serious U.S. debt crisis, or periods of ultra-inflation driven by that fiscal dominance we talked about earlier.
Right, it all ties back together. So if this institutional takeover plan succeeds, what's the end game? What's the ultimate financialized future that Dixon sees Wall Street building?
The end game, in his dramatic phrasing, is to tokenize the world.
Tokenize the world, what does that mean practically?
It sounds futuristic, but he stresses it's really about replicating the kind of scams and schemes we saw in the Wild West days of crypto. The pump and dumps, the rug pulls, but doing it within a regulated structure where the institutions are protected.
How are they protected?
The core strategy is always the same. Socialize the losses and privatize the gains. This involves tokenizing pretty much everything, real-world assets like real estate, art, infrastructure projects, then issuing stablecoins backed by government debt, which perfectly mirrors the fiscal dominance strategy at the sovereign level.
So creating digital representations of everything, controlled within their system.
Exactly. And crucially, this new regulated tokenized system will have compliance baked in through external factors.
What kind of factors?
ESG scores, environmental social governance, and mandatory carbon credit scores. These will be applied to the tokenized assets.
How would that work?
Well, imagine your home is tokenized. If you have a low carbon credit score, or maybe a low social score based on your online activity, the centralized system controlled by entities like BlackRock could potentially restrict transactions related to your tokenized home, or maybe impose penalties, or even leverage it against you. It links your real-world assets directly to your compliance score.
That is a genuinely terrifying vision. And it brings us back to that idea of a command and control state. How does Dixon connect the dots between the social division we see everywhere today and manufacturing consent or compliance for this kind of system?
He argues that a lot of the increasing polarization and social unrest, the focus on immigration crises, hate campaigns online, deep political division, isn't entirely organic. He suggests it's being engineered or at least significantly amplified.
Amplified for what purpose?
As a tool. A deliberate distraction. Keep the population focused on these highly emotional, divisive issues, fighting amongst themselves.
So they don't notice the bigger picture.
Exactly. So they're diverted from the systemic financial issues, the erosion of their purchasing power, the centralization of control. And this engineered chaos, he argues, actually makes the population more willing to accept top-down command and control structures later on. Things like UBI, digital ID, the programmable social credit score. They can be presented as necessary solutions to restore order and stability.
Wow. Okay, this entire quite intense deep dive has really been building towards one critical point, the personal choice that every listener faces right now. And that's the focus of our final section, part 4, the accumulation race and personal conviction.
Yeah, this is absolutely where the rubber meets the road. Dixon frames it as a very immediate, very real-world decision that you, the listener, have to grapple with right now within this 5-year window he keeps emphasizing.
And the decision is?
Do you prioritize paying down your existing debts, mortgage, credit cards, whatever?
Right.
Or do you prioritize the relentless accumulation of Bitcoin, specifically in self-custody?
That's a tough choice for many people. He actually faced this himself early on, didn't he? Which provides a pretty powerful example.
He did. He talks about being deep in debt early in his career. He recounts being at that first Bitcoin conference in Prague. Bitcoin had crashed hard, from around $30 down to $3.
Wow, a 90% drop.
Yeah, and he had this dilemma. Use the little capital he had to pay down high-interest debt, or take a leap of faith and buy Bitcoin at $3.
What did he do?
He chose Bitcoin, based on this realization that he had to acquire the sound money asset first. He had to pay himself in sound money before servicing the debt denominated in failing fiat. And, well, history shows that turned out to be a life-altering decision for him.
Okay, but that requires a huge mental shift, right? How can listeners practically adopt that kind of framework, especially when debt collectors are calling?
The essential mental shift, he argues, is to stop pricing everything in dollars or whatever your local fiat currency is. Start pricing things your time, your assets, your goals in Bitcoin, or maybe gold terms.
Price everything in Bitcoin.
Yeah. Dixon contends that once you make that mental switch, you start to see that most conventional assets, stocks, fiat savings accounts, even a lot of real estate, aren't really investments in the true sense. They're more like dollar-denominated vehicles for holding debt or trying to outpace inflation.
And they look like bad investments when compared to Bitcoin.
Because Bitcoin's fixed supply, its absolute scarcity, instantly highlights the rapid, relentless, and maybe even terminal devaluation of the dollar and other fiat currencies. Compared to something truly scarce, most other things look like they're melting.
Okay, but Bitcoin is notoriously volatile. The price swings wildly. How can someone commit to an accumulation strategy when the price might crash 50% next week? Doesn't that feel incredibly risky?
His core advice here is pretty radical. He says the fiat price you buy Bitcoin at is ultimately irrelevant in the grand scheme of things, especially within this 5-year race.
Irrelevant. How can the price be irrelevant?
Because the strategy isn't about timing the market. It's about commitment. The commitment is to accumulate a certain amount of Bitcoin consistently, say monthly or weekly, regardless of the current dollar price.
Dollar cost averaging, essentially.
Exactly, but with extreme conviction. If the price crashes, you don't panic sell. You should actually celebrate because your fixed amount of fiat now buys you more Bitcoin, more ownership of that scarce network. The goal is just relentless, conviction-driven accumulation over these next 5 years.
Let's touch on where his own deep conviction comes from. It didn't actually start with Bitcoin, did it? It started with the failure of more traditional attempts at monetary reform.
That's a really critical part of his backstory, yeah. Before he even knew about Bitcoin, he was heavily involved in political movements in the UK, like Positive Money. They were focused on fundamental monetary reform. Specifically, they were trying to get fractional reserve banking banned.
So trying to fix the system from within?
Exactly. They saw the debt-based money system as a giant Ponzi scheme and were looking for a political or regulatory solution.
But the political system didn't exactly welcome that kind of technical change, did it?
Resistant is putting it mildly. He describes it as structurally hostile to the very idea. In 2009, he and his partners actually applied to the Bank of England for a license to create a full reserve bank. A bank that would hold 100% reserves against deposits, unlike fractional reserve banks. They called it Bank to the Future.
Okay, what happened?
The conditions the Bank of England imposed were basically impossible and designed, in his view, to kill the project. They demanded a huge deposit, £60 million, which was prohibitive in itself.
Wow.
But the real killer was the requirement that this new full reserve bank had to be built on top of an existing fractional reserve clearing bank,
Right.
specifically Barclays.
Wait, so the full reserve bank had to rely on the very system it was trying to replace?
Precisely. It completely defeated the entire purpose. The regulatory system was fundamentally designed to protect the incumbent fractional reserve system. Nothing else was allowed.
And that failure was the catalyst.
That regulatory brick wall was the ultimate catalyst for him. It convinced him that a political or regulatory fix for the monetary system was simply impossible. The incumbents would never allow it. This deep disillusionment led him directly to that first Bitcoin conference in Prague in 2011.
Where he met some of the early pioneers.
Yeah, he met figures like Johnny Bitcoin and the rather radical early spokesperson Amir Taki. And it was there, seeing Bitcoin's decentralized nature, its fixed supply, its resistance to control, that he had his light bulb moment. He realized this was the technical solution, the only viable technical solution to the systemic debt crisis that political efforts had utterly failed to address.
That long history certainly informs his perspective on this accumulation race and also quality of life. He does acknowledge, doesn't he, that people can't just live like monks forever. There has to be a point where you transition from pure frugal accumulation to actually enjoying life once that financial anxiety is dealt with.
He does, and he uses his own family history to underscore why that financial security obsession is so deep-seated for him. He shares the really tragic story of his father.
What happened?
His father had worked hard, accumulated £1 million, mostly in tech stocks, and then lost absolutely everything in the dot-com bust around 2000. Wiped out completely.
Oh, wow.
And Dixon says seeing that, experiencing that financial ruin firsthand, is what fueled his lifelong obsession with finding a form of money, a system that couldn't be just wiped out by market crashes or centralized failures or, inflation.
And that connects directly to his point about the dramatic drop in living standards over
Yeah,
generations.
it's a really compelling comparison he makes to anchor the struggle people face today.
What's the comparison?
He looks back at the post-World War II era. He notes that back then it was genuinely possible, realistic even, for someone like a bus driver on a single income to support a wife and maybe 7 children, own a home.
That sounds almost unbelievable today.
It's mathematically impossible for most people today. And that, he says, starkly illustrates the catastrophic generational devastation caused by decades of relentless currency inflation and devaluation. It's stolen the future from average families.
And just finally, on the personal conviction side, he makes a point of pushing back against a common joke or meme in the Bitcoin community, the reluctant wife who doesn't get it.
Yeah, he challenges that stereotype directly. He points out that his own wife, Bliss, who actually co-founded his company, Bank to the Future, with him, she was one of the earliest women deeply involved in Bitcoin. And he says she often had stronger conviction than he did about the absolute necessity of that relentless monthly accumulation, especially in the early volatile days.
So it underscores that this kind of conviction needs to be shared, understood, and committed to, perhaps as a family or partnership.
Exactly. It's not a solo mission for many people.
Okay. This has been an incredibly detailed journey through a source material that really demands serious attention. We've gone from global fiscal dominance and geopolitics right down to the very personal choice of whether to buy Bitcoin or pay off your credit card. So let's try and synthesize it. What is the absolute core, the ultimate takeaway from Simon Dixon's warning?
The central thesis, the main thrust, is this. Wall Street, with BlackRock leading the charge, isn't trying to kill Bitcoin anymore. They've shifted tactics. They are now implementing a very calculated, highly coordinated scheme, what he labels the proof of weapons network, specifically designed to centralize control over the asset.
And the tools they're using.
They're using regulatory capture, think Operation Choke Point 2.0, shutting down competitors. They're using the ETF structure as a Trojan horse for custody. They're leveraging public treasury companies like MicroStrategy via index inclusion. It's a multi-pronged strategy to consolidate power over Bitcoin.
And the end game of this consolidation.
To build a system designed to effectively extract Bitcoin ownership from the masses, likely during an inevitable, perhaps even engineered market crash, or a major economic inflection point linked to debt or inflation.
And amidst all this complexity, what is the single crucial distinction Dixon makes? The dividing line between those who potentially fall into this centralization trap and those who achieve genuine financial independence through Bitcoin.
It comes down to one thing and one thing only: absolute self-custody, holding your own keys. Proof of work secured independently by you, outside of any exchange, any fund, any intermediary, any centralized entity.
That's the shield.
That is the only guaranteed protection, in his view, against the risks he outlines: the MSTR stock leverage risk, the potential for another Celsius-style engineered crisis, the broader debt schemes Wall Street is famous for constructing. Self-custody is the opt-out.
Okay. So you, the listener, have now received a pretty comprehensive briefing on Dixon's analysis of this Wall Street attack phase and the 5-year race he believes we're in. Now, as always, we want to leave you with a final thought to consider.
Dixon lays it out pretty starkly. He argues the choices you make in the next 5 years will largely determine whether you get funneled into the centralized, potentially Orwellian future, the one defined by UBI, programmable money, social credit scores, digital IDs, or whether you manage to secure your financial independence outside of that system.
So reflect on the specific mechanisms and threats we've discussed today, the way MicroStrategy could be co-opted, the risks associated with leverage from lenders like Cantor Fitzgerald, the vision of a tokenized world enforcing compliance.
And ask yourself, what is the single, immediate, non-negotiable step you're going to take, starting today or this week, to ensure your Bitcoin remains truly yours, outside of Wall Street's proof of weapons network? Is it finally committing to learning the practical skill of self-custody? Is it setting up that automated monthly buy, regardless of price, and committing to it for the next 5 years? According to Dixon, the window for preparation for getting on the right side of this shift is closing fast.